Hello, everyone. And today we're going to start talking about World War II. And we're actually going to talk about this in a couple of different chunks. So the first thing we need to touch on is what the United States has been doing up until this point. Because the Second World War doesn't just break out of nowhere. There's things happening in the decade prior to that, the 1930s, that are going to lead to this happening. And so the question now is, what were the Americans doing in the 1930s? That was during the Great Depression. And frankly, the United States is a little preoccupied, but we're going to look at what's going on with international relations in the 1930s first. So, like I was saying, during the 1930s, the Americans are a little preoccupied with the Depression. International relations is definitely playing a minor role in public affairs, but FDR is going to embark on a number of departures in foreign policy. The first of these is that he will agree to exchange ambassadors with the Soviet Union in 1933. This is made largely in an effort to stimulate trade, and it is a vast departure from previous Republican administrations in the last decade, which had refused to welcome a Soviet ambassador because of the general fear of communism and the spread of communism. Another place where we're going to be making a shift in our foreign policies is with Latin America. We're going to see the formalization of a policy that was actually begun by Hoover, where the U.S. will be repudiating the right to intervene militarily in the internal affairs of Latin American countries. This became known as the Good Neighbor Policy. You can see a nice little poster for it over to the side here, and offers something of a belated recognition of the sovereignty of America's neighbors. The U.S. will still, however, lend its support to dictators in places like Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, thus making ourselves still not terribly popular in these Latin American countries. Now, in Europe, the rather ominous developments, not only in Europe but also in Asia, will also, however, quickly overshadow events in Latin America. By the mid-1930s, it seemed quite clear that the rule of law was disintegrating in international relations and that war was just on the horizon. So let's take a look in Asia first. Japan has been expanding rather aggressively throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. And in the 1930s, in the mid-1930s, it is going to make its move, reaching towards an area of China called Manchuria and actually invading Manchuria in China as well. But perhaps the most well-known and almost more troubling is the German campaign to control the entire continent, and this is the brainchild of a new German chancellor, Adolf Hitler. Now, Germany, when we left it at the end of the First World War, was a republic, the Weimar Republic to be exact. So how exactly does Hitler rise to power in a supposedly democratic nation? Well, TED Talks has a response to this.
How did Adolf Hitler, a tyrant who orchestrated one of the largest genocides in human history, rise to power in a democratic country? The story begins at the end of World War I. With the successful Allied advance in 1918, Germany realized the war was unwinnable and signed an armistice ending the fighting. As its imperial government collapsed, civil unrest and worker strikes spread across the nation. Fearing a communist revolution, major parties joined to suppress the uprisings, establishing the parliamentary Weimar Republic. One of the new government's first tasks was implementing the peace treaty imposed by the Allies. In addition to losing over a tenth of its territory and dismantling its army, Germany had to accept full responsibility for the war and pay reparations, debilitating its already weakened economy. All this was seen as a humiliation by many nationalists and veterans, They wrongly believed the war could have been won if the army hadn't been betrayed by politicians and protesters. For Hitler, these views became obsession, and his bigotry and paranoid delusions led him to pin the blame on Jews. His words found resonance in a society with many anti-Semitic people. By this time, hundreds of thousands of Jews had integrated into German society, but many Germans continued to perceive them as outsiders. After World War I, Jewish success led to ungrounded accusations of subversion and war profiteering. It cannot be stressed enough that these conspiracy theories were born out of fear, anger, and bigotry, not fact. Nonetheless, Hitler found success with them. When he joined a small nationalist political party, his manipulative public speaking launched him into its leadership and drew increasingly larger crowds. Combining anti-Semitism with populist resentment, the Nazis denounced both communism and capitalism as international Jewish conspiracies to destroy Germany. The Nazi Party was not initially popular. After they made an unsuccessful attempt at overthrowing the government, the party was banned, and Hitler jailed for treason. But upon his release about a year later, he immediately began to rebuild the movement. And then, in 1929, the Great Depression happened. It led to American banks withdrawing their loans from Germany, and the already struggling German economy collapsed overnight. Hitler took advantage of the people's anger, offering them convenient scapegoats and a promise to restore Germany's former greatness. Mainstream parties proved unable to handle the crisis, while left-wing opposition was too fragmented by internal squabbles. And so, some of the frustrated public flocked to the Nazis, increasing their parliamentary votes from under 3% to over 18% in just 2 years. In 1932, Hitler ran for president, losing the election to decorated war hero General von Hindenburg. But with 36% of the vote, Hitler had demonstrated the extent of his support. The following year, advisors and business leaders convinced Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor, hoping to channel his popularity for their own goals. Though the chancellor was only the administrative head of parliament, Hitler steadily expanded the power of his position. While his supporters formed paramilitary groups and fought protesters in the streets, Hitler raised fears of a communist uprising and argued that only he could restore law and order. Then, in 1933, a young worker was convicted of setting fire to the Parliament building. Hitler used the event to convince the government to grant him emergency powers. Within a matter of months, freedom of the press was abolished, other parties were disbanded, and anti-Jewish laws were passed. Many of Hitler's early radical supporters were arrested and executed, along with potential rivals. And when President Hindenburg died in August 1934, it was clear there would be no new election. Disturbingly, many of Hitler's early measures didn't require mass repression. His speeches exploited people's fear and ire to drive their support behind him and the Nazi Party. Meanwhile, businessmen and intellectuals wanting to be on the right side of public opinion endorsed Hitler. They assured themselves and each other that his more extreme rhetoric was only for show. Decades later, Hitler's rise remains a warning of how fragile democratic institutions can be in the face of angry crowds and a leader willing to feed their anger and exploit their fears.
All right, so that gives us an idea of how Hitler comes to power in Germany. And after he rather brutally consolidates his own rule in that country, he embarks on a campaign to control the rest of the continent. He begins by sending German troops to occupy the Rhineland. The UK, the US, and France all failed to oppose him and allowed this action to take place. And so, given that, Hitler became even more audacious. In 1938, he annexed Austria, the Sudetenland, and part of Czechoslovakia before eventually taking over all of Czechoslovakia. And again, this went largely unchallenged. The Western powers, the British, the Americans, and the French, largely adopted a policy of appeasement when it came to Hitler. And to give an idea of what that is, I have another video to show you.
A big power intimidates its neighbors. A crisis erupts. World leaders meet to head off war. A deal is struck and peace is proclaimed. But rather than deterring aggression, the deal inadvertently promotes it. Within a year, the world is at war. I'm Jim Lindsay, and this is History Lessons. Our topic today is the Munich Agreement, which was signed by the leaders of Germany, Italy, Britain, and France in the early morning hours of September 30th, 1938. The backdrop to the Munich Agreement is Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany's remilitarization. Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany in 1933. A year later, he made himself the dictator, or Führer, and ushered in the Third Reich. Hitler moved aggressively to jumpstart a foundering German economy and to jettison the constraints that had been imposed on the German military after World War I. European leaders nervously looked the other way as he ran roughshod over the security provisions of the Treaty of Versailles and reasserted German power in Central Europe. One goal of Hitler's policies was to create Lebensraum, or greater living space for Germans. The belief that Germany needed expanded borders included the idea that ethnic Germans living in neighboring countries should come under German rule. In March 1938, Germany absorbed Austria and the Anschluss. Hitler then turned his attention to the Sudetenland, those parts of Czechoslovakia where some 3 million ethnic Germans predominated. Hitler grew increasingly hostile to Czechoslovakia over the course of the summer of 1938. In mid-September, he gave a fiery anti-Czech speech, raising fears that war was imminent. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain responded by rushing to Germany for talks to keep the continent at peace. Chamberlain approached his talks with Hitler mindful of how the First World War had laid waste to a generation of Europeans and worried that new technologies like the airplane would make the next war even more horrific. He also worried that the British military was ill-prepared to fight Germany and that the British public wanted peace, not war. So without consulting Czechoslovakian leaders, Chamberlain agreed to Hitler's demand that Germany absorb the Sudetenland. Chamberlain then persuaded the Czechoslovakian and French governments to accept his concession. The details were worked out at two subsequent sets of meetings. The Czechoslovakian government was pointedly not invited to the concluding talks at Munich that finalized the country's dismemberment. On October 1, 1938, Czechoslovakian frontier guards left their posts and German troops moved into the Sudetenland. The day before, Chamberlain had flown back to London where he was met by cheering crowds. He waved a memo Hitler had signed pledging Germany's peaceful intentions and told the crowd that he had brought peace for our time.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Not all of Chamberlain's fellow Britons believed that he had saved the day. Winston Churchill's response to what Chamberlain had wrought at Munich was withering. You are given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war. As we all know, Churchill was right. 11 months after the Munich Agreement was signed to cheers, German troops invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. The terms Munich and appeasement entered the diplomatic hall of shame. What is a lesson of the Munich Agreement? Just this: appeasing an adversary's demands may diffuse a crisis, but it can also increase the chances of war by emboldening that adversary to demand more. Chamberlain thought that if Germany gained the Sudetenland, that Hitler would finally be satisfied with the status quo in Europe. But Hitler instead viewed Munich as confirming his belief that Britain and France both lacked the will to stop German expansion. It is worth remembering the Munich Agreement as we survey potential threats around the globe today. China is a growing military power that is challenging the territorial claims of its neighbors in Northeast and Southeast Asia.
All right, I'm just going to stop him right there because he's talking more about current events now. But this was how the British and particularly the French, or particularly the British and the French rather, reacted to Hitler's efforts to expand. Also, you have in Europe Benito Mussolini, who's taken over in Italy. Mussolini is in fact the founder of fascism, and he was also making aggressive overtures, this time in Africa by invading and conquering Ethiopia. You also have Franco in Spain, who is also a fascist, although he remains officially neutral in the coming war. While all of this was alarming to Roosevelt, he was, however, tied to the policy of appeasement and to the U.S. desire to generally stay out of the war, which is what we'll talk about in the next video.